How's it going, everybody? So, the last episode that I recorded was on the reality of symbols, and it brings up a really important topic that I want to highlight and maybe dive a little deeper into today. And that is the topic of how the modern mind, the way that we think about things in the modern world, clashes with the classical mind and also the Catholic mind. There are some pretty unanimously acknowledged conclusions of the Catholic or even the classical mind as opposed to the modern mind. Those would be things like the inherent goodness of the sexes and the distinguishment between the sexes. You can also think of things like, this may not be so much the classical mind as a whole, but a large part of it would be the difference between atheism and theism, right? Also things such as like what things we take for granted, the ways that we look at ethics. And I guess maybe I should clarify, I don't mean this necessarily as the classical mind as though all the Greeks or all the Romans thought this way, right? Of course not. There were many Greeks and Romans in the pagan world who were very hedonistic and really had philosophies very close to the modern philosophies of today. But what I'm saying more so is the classical mind to be that derives itself particularly from Plato and Aristotle and Socrates as well, via Plato, right? So those three players are kind of what I would consider the classical mind, okay? Or at least they're the three pivotal players of the classical mind. And then that kind of morphs, or I guess it'd be better to say Christianity morphs that classical mind into something and makes it its own, okay? And this would be the classical Christian mind or philosophy. And there are numerous ways in which the modern world and modern thinking clashes with the classical Christian view of reality. Okay, not only in the conclusions that the modern world comes to versus the classical Christian world, but also in the very bases, the very base things that each system, each paradigm takes for granted are generally very different. Not to say that they are different in every way. There would of course be things that the modern mind and the classical Christian mind would have in common in their base assumptions about the world. Okay, that would be things like human dignity, although I think they understand human dignity in slightly different ways, which brings them to radically different conclusions. Okay, and this is something, the difference between the classical Christian mind and the modern mind is something that is not like you can look at all Christians today and say, well, they all take the classical Christian mind and none of them take the modern mind. No, there's actually a very prevalent, there are very, very prevalent even denominations of Christianity that are really define themselves upon a modern mentality. But then there are also what you might call classical Christian communities or churches, such as the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, and the magisterial Protestant churches. Those original churches really springing from Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, the Presbyterians with, what was his name? I don't remember. I'm blanking on the guy's name. And then the Anglican. Those that really try to go back to the roots of the Protestant thought will be much closer to, say, the Catholic and Orthodox mind. Although I think that there are, in many ways, the seeds of the modern mind in much of, not all of, but much of those magisterial Protestant reformers. Okay. Now, again, there are many distinctions to be made here. I'm not trying to color things with a broad brush. There are many Protestants who would agree with what I'm going to say, and there are probably many also who would disagree. Okay, there are many Catholics who will disagree with what I'm about to say, And that is really the group that I want to hone in on, because I think that that a Catholic in particular, or an Orthodox Christian who does not espouse a classical Christian philosophy really is going to have some very serious cognitive dissonance, some very serious flaws in their worldview. I think that's really what I'm trying to argue here, is that if one, as a Catholic, I'll just focus on Catholics in particular, if one as a Catholic, the modern philosophies, as many Catholics tried to do in particularly the 19th and 20th centuries, up until our present day, it really begins to ravel the entire Catholic paradigm from the ground up, from the roots. And let me explain why. By contrasting a few things within these two views, the modern view and the classical Christian view. Okay, particularly, and I've probably made this distinction ad nauseum by now in my podcast, but it's because I think it is vitally relevant for us to understand this difference, the difference between metaphysical realism, and which I think, to boil it down, to oversimplify it for the sake of making a point, would be distinguished, or I would make the distinction like this. Metaphysical realism sees universals, which are things like, you could say, for example, the treeness of a tree. What makes a tree what it is? What makes a group of trees what they are? Is a real thing in some way. Now, you can therefore further distinguish in what way it's real. But that metaphysical realism is contrasted to a view called nominalism, which says that the treeness of a tree is simply a construct of the human mind. It's also known as conceptualism, this view. And there are, as with metaphysical realism, there are a multitude of views here. But again, for the sake of simplification, I'm going to simplify this nominalistic view to the view which is also known as conceptualism. Okay, saying that really a universal is simply just a construct of my mind in order to group things together and make it easier for me to understand the world, although it has no actual basis in reality. It's just something within my own mind, okay, that really I create. And it may not seem initially to many people that these two views are as foundational as I'm claiming. It might seem to you that, well, why does that even matter, how I view the treeness of a tree? I mean, it's a tree, it exists. Why in the world does it matter if the treeness of the tree is real in some way as opposed to not real, or a construct of my mind? Why does it even matter? And the reason is because, and maybe a tree might not make the importance of this distinction stand out as much. But when you talk about human beings, okay, what is the human beingness of a human being? Okay, what is human beingness, or as we would generally call it, human nature? What is human nature? What is it? Is it something real? Does it tell us about what we are? Does it tell us something real about what we are as individuals? Does that collective description tell us something real about what we are as individuals? Or is human nature simply a construct of our own minds in order so that we might have, some way of processing the world around us that makes sense? And it's just a an evolutionary advantage that we have, that we're able to process information in such a way. These to flesh out the importance here, I want to kind of take that example of human nature further. If I believe that human nature is something real, and it tells me about what I am individually, then that has very real bearing upon what I do with myself. Okay, if I, as a human being, am meant to reflect human nature, which is a real thing in some way, ideal human nature. Okay, let's say. What is ideal human nature? What is it? Does it mean anything to be a good person, or is being a good person simply a construct of our minds so that we just make society work better and more efficiently? Okay, right? Like that's a very concrete or relevant example of this dichotomy. It's immediately applicable to how we view ethics and morality. Because if human nature is something real, and it tells me, it gives me a guideline at least of what I'm supposed to be like, how I'm supposed to comport myself, and how I'm supposed to act, then I have a basis in reality for moral action at that point. If, on the other hand, human nature is simply a construct of my mind, then I have no real basis for how I should act. There is no reference point, right? There's no ideal human being at that point. There's no such thing as virtue. There's no such thing as vice in this paradigm. I think when you take it to its end, there's no real reason for there to be morality. Now, in the Middle Ages, many people were still Christian, and many of the early Protestants did take upon this sort of nominalistic philosophy. Not all of them, again, but many of them probably. I think I could say many of them did. And the way that they got around this question of morality was they said, well, God determines morality. God determines morality. Morality isn't reflected in ideal human nature. No, it's only because God has commanded us to do certain things, and that's why we do them. It's like this positivistic idea of morality, and I think that there's a lot of problems with that idea, because it really I think it anthropomorphizes or makes God in our own image more than he is. Okay, now it is true, looking at the scriptures, like, yes, God did command or did give us commandments, things to do for the proper ordering of our morality and thus our society, right? But the question is, did God just kind of make those out of thin air, out of his own will, or did he give them to us because in some way, in a very real way, they reflect what we are, and they reflect an ideal of what we are to be. And I think that that's a very important distinction to make. So, the question of morality is a very prevalent reason as to why this difference between metaphysical realism and nominalism is important. Another very prevalent reason to Christianity in particular is because without believing in human nature as a real thing, we cannot stand the doctrines, the dogmas really, of the first 7 ecumenical councils, particularly those as regards Christology, how we understand Christ, and how we understand Christ's human nature in relation to his divine nature. I mean, there's no point in even talking about that if those things are just ways that we're trying to, if they're just constructs of the human mind, then they don't really mean anything, and then therefore those Christological dogmas of the first 7 ecumenical councils really they have no basis in reality at that point. It's just some fun words that we put together to try to make sense of this whole Jesus thing, right? And you do see certain Christian groups, as we get closer and closer to modern times, beginning to deny those very basic Christological dogmas. Okay, the dogma that Christ is both human and divine. He has a full human nature and he has a full divine nature. You have certain people going off into Arianism on the one side, saying that, now I'm going to get it mixed up. Arianism would say that Christ's human nature, like basically that he's more human than he is divine. He's like a demigod, basically, is the simplistic version of it. And then you would have the other side of the other extreme of Nestorianism, which would say that Christ's human nature is really just kind of, it's not that important as compared to his divine nature. He's only, like, his human nature is kind of just like a figment, would be like an extreme version of it, right? And you do have certain Christian groups starting to take that back up as we get into modern time. Okay, I guess I don't want to implicate myself here on saying something wrong, but I'm quite sure that the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons do not accept those Christological dogmas about Christ. The Mormons basically believe that Christ is a demigod, which is a type of Arianism, and I want to say that Jehovah's Witnesses believe in the opposite, that Christ's human nature is kind of not really important, and therefore it's a type of that emphasizes Christ's divine nature over his human nature. Now I might be wrong on that second one there, but on the Jehovah's Witness thing, but yeah. So I hope I'm making this clear. And as you can probably tell, I'm still trying to dig deeper and deeper into all of this. But I guess to bring it back, why is this dichotomy important? And why is it important for us as Catholics in particular not to espouse a nominalistic philosophy, or even, really any modern philosophy in particular? Because I think at its root, all modern philosophies, starting with René Descartes, going to Leibniz and John Locke and Hume, and getting into Nietzsche and and then further and further, they're all rooted in nominalism. They are. At base, they have nominalism at their base. Now they all branch off into different conclusions, but I think it's fair to say that they do have a nominalistic outlook upon life as their base. And for reasons that I've said, I just think that it's utterly incompatible with the Catholic faith, with Catholic philosophy, and therefore with Catholic theology. You can't understand the basic Christological dogmas of the faith from a nominalist paradigm. It's impossible. It's impossible. And then it kind of trickles down, as I discussed last time in the episode on symbolism. It really trickles down to how we view everything around us, how we view what the physical world is and the importance of the physical world. Is the physical world just a bunch of atoms mashed together and we're just in our minds trying to figure it all out and categorize it? That would be kind of the nominalistic conclusion. But the realist conclusion would be that, well, yes, that is, on one level, on the empirical level, what the physical world around us is. But it has meaning. There's meaning in those atoms, in this physical world around us. There's meaning to a beautiful building, a beautiful cathedral, a beautiful government building, for example. There's a reality in that symbolism. Like, again, like I said last time, symbolism is not just something within our minds that we create in order to categorize the world. Beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. Beauty is out there. We see it. We don't create beauty. In a very real way, beauty created and creates us. And we discover it in the world around us. We don't create beauty, we discover beauty. Okay? And I think that is one of the most acute conclusions that the modern Catholic Church has come to where it disagrees with itself. And I'm not saying the church as a whole, I'm saying, parts of the church. Because there are many, and have been many, in particularly the 1970s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, who clearly believed that beauty was in the eye of the beholder. Which is why we have UFO churches, and we have crazy symbolism that doesn't even mean anything anymore. It's just like a crucifix made out of wire framing, and it's so obscure that it doesn't show us anything about the reality of what happened. And all the things that I explained last time in our last episode on symbolism. It just, when you don't view the world out of a paradigm of metaphysical realism, you will eventually come to the conclusion that all that there is matter, and that matter doesn't mean anything. Now, I want to make just another further distinction here, because there's a type of materialism that could be considered a realist materialism. Aristotle, I think, would be within that category. It's kind of I think it's kind of unclear as to what Aristotle believed as regards theism. I mean, he does give an argument for God, or for a type of God, really. But I've also heard some claim that Aristotle was a materialist, and that could just mean that he was a materialist as regards the human being. Okay, like once we die, that's it, right? And that's a completely different thing. But there's I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a type of materialism that believes that the material around us has meaning, and then there's a type of materialism that says that nothing matters. None of the materials around me have any meaning, and that would be the difference. I think that at that point you're getting to like a nihilism type deal, okay, to where none of it matters. And really, I think it's safe to say that nominalism, I think, logically leads to a type of nihilism, to a type of none of it matters. Because why would it matter if it's just a creation of my own brain? What am I? I mean, I guess it matters if I think of myself as ultra important, but most people, upon deep self-reflection, realize that they're not that important. We do. Like, we realize we have dignity, of course. But as to like a gaudy type of importance, most people, upon deep self-reflection, will come to the conclusion that they are not all that important. And that's a beautiful thing. Dignity, but not necessarily self-aggrandizement or whatever. All right. Anyway, hope that makes sense. I might make another episode coming up, just furthering this discussion, because as you can tell from my podcast, I think this whole topic is of paramount importance. All right.